Welcome to part 2 of the Sylenth Masterclass video tutorial. So in part 1, we looked at the brain of Sylenth, this menu screen. Now we're going to be discussing this oscillator section. So I'm going to load an initial preset here. Alright, so actually first thing we're going to do before we even hit the oscillator section is I'm going to talk about this silver strip right here. And this determines, so the first thing you have is it determines your polyphony. So if you set it to 1 and I try to play multiple notes on the keyboard, you can see at the bottom of your screen on the keys section, I'm hitting more than one key, but it's playing 1. So if you're playing, to save CPU, if you're just playing a sound with a couple notes like this, where you're only ever playing like 3 or 4 notes, you can set it to such. But if you're playing really deep layered chords, you're going to want to set the polyphony to a higher amount. So then you have this voices, and that will just it'll show you how many notes you're pressing basically. So if I do a triad, 3 voices, 7, and it goes up to 8 depending on your polyphony. So then this next section is called part select. Sylenth is a 4 oscillator synth, and it's a 2-page synth. So you'll see that basically everything's the same, except it's a slightly different color. So what that does is it just allows you a really easy way, instead of having a really crammed user interface. Like imagine if there was 4 oscillators all on one page. They let you, Sylenth, the designers made it so that you could open up different pages. It also gives you more control over your synth because you can have a different amp envelope value and cutoff for part A and part B. So it's kind of like having 2 synths in one. Then you have this solo knob. So what this will do is, let's say you have a 2-part synth going, and here's the sound we have. You can solo part A. There's part A. And there's part B. So when you're actually into making a sound and doing sound design stuff, it really helps to be able to solo it. All right, so next you have this illuminated sync knob, and the sync button, basically what it does is it forces some of the timing parameters like LFO rates and delay times to be synchronized with your host tempo. So if you are doing a song in an EDM tempo of like 128, having sync helps, because then it will display values instead of in hertz or in frequencies or things like that. It'll display them in bar values like quarter note, eighth note, etc. So it makes it more musical to actually create sounds in. So that really helps. All right, so let's move down to this oscillator section here, this little brown tab. Real quick, I wanted to talk about what an oscillator is in synthesis and kind of how it works into subtractive synthesis. Subtractive synthesis is one of the most common forms of synthesizing sounds. It basically always just follows the same schematic routing path, where you have a tone being generated in an oscillator, and that's being sent to your filter, and the output of your filter is sent to your amplifier. So Sylenth is doing basically the same thing, but with some steps in between. So you have a sound, you have your oscillator that's generating a tone. So let me go to an initial preset here. So that's just generating a sine. That's going to a cutoff type, which we can define if we'd like. And then that's being routed out to your amp, which usually has some gain staging options called ADSR, which stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. Subtractive synthesis is often referred to as analog synthesis or virtual analog synthesis. It's kind of harkening back to the old synthesizing techniques of like a Moog or the actual old analog hardware. What I wanted to talk about first with that in mind is the oscillator. An oscillator is used to generate basically a usable sound or a tone. So if I just hold this down, that's a sine wave because that's the waveform I selected. And the reason it's called an oscillator is sine oscillates, it vibrates through the air. And the synthesizer behind the scenes, Sylenth, is telling it how quickly to vibrate. And that corresponds to the note that you are playing on the keyboard into a hertz value, which is then converted to a note value by our ears. With Sylenth, you have you have 8 different waveforms to choose from in your oscillator type. So I'm going to start there because it makes no sense to start up here unless we talk about the waveform. So your first waveform is a sine. And the sine wave is one of the fundamental waveforms to sound. It has a very clean and hollow sound. It's great for sub basses. It's great to layer in with your bass patches. So the next waveform we have available to us in Sylenth is the saw wave. And the saw wave is a staple of synthesis. Basically, what you're going to get with the saw wave is a very bright sound. It's used in a lot of leads. It's used a lot in EDM and current genres that are popular. So it's also known as a sawtooth wave. Like I said, it's very bright and rich, so it plays very nicely with filters and distortions and things like that. The next wave we have is this triangle wave. Now a triangle wave it sounds a little bit like a sine and a saw kind of put together, with a little bit more of the sine to it. So it's kind of hollow sounding, but it's brighter than your general sine wave. The next waveform we have is this pulse waveform, and it's often in other synthesizers referred to as a square wave, sometimes a rectangle wave. It has a couple different names, but it's generally the same thing. It has a very sharp and crisp sound because it's a very uniform wave type. So you might kind of remember it from... Yes, I just played a Kesha song. It's basically just that's kind of the waveform they use, blended with a little saw wave probably. Then we get these, the next thing we get are variations of this pulse wave. And so basically what you're getting with that is it's just, you can actually see graphically what's going on. So here it's fairly uniform, right? The distance between the downward facing peak, the space in between it, and the upward peak of the amplitude is the same. Well, then if you go to this H pulse, you have a shorter distance on the left than on the right. So that affects the sound. It's just getting more nasally. And then we also have this this Q pulse, which is even more narrow and nasally. And those are good for creating kind of vocal stabs and things with like Melbourne bounce and trap leads. Then we have this triangular saw. This is a blend between a triangle and a saw. So it has the richness and the subtle kind of warmth and hollowness of both the saw and the triangle wave put together. And finally, we have the noise. Some synths come with a dedicated noise oscillator, like you'll have oscillator 1, oscillator 2, oscillator 3, and then a noise oscillator. Well, Sylenth, it doesn't give you that, but it does let you use a noise type in one of your oscillators, so you can still make a 3 oscillator sound using part A and part B, and on part 4, our oscillator B2, you can just load up a noise instance of a noise waveform, and you can control the noise type by your filter type, and we'll get into that later. So there's a crash course that kind of extends beyond Sylenth. It's just kind of discussing waveform types in subtractive synthesis. So now that we got that covered, I feel like I can more adequately talk about the actual knobs and sliders in the oscillator section. So the first thing you'll notice is you have this pitch box, and an octave goes up by semitone values. So an octave goes up by... So that's an octave difference. So if I play right now, I'm playing... Let me go to a custom menu. So I'm playing C3 right now. And if I move this up 1, it still says I'm playing C3. I haven't moved my hand, but the pitch moved up a whole octave. So that's useful to just blend sounds together. Like let's say you're making a super saw lead. You want your lead to kind of have the middle frequencies and upper frequencies represented, so you might pitch one oscillator down and then have the rest pitched at 0 or 1. So that's why that is there. And then you have this note value where you can actually tune it on a note difference. So here is a C note. If I drag this up 1, now I'm still playing C3, but it's playing the sound coming out as a C sharp, so you can stack chords. So then if I pull up another instance of a sound here, So right now it's up 5 semitones, so I'm playing a fourth above it. This oscillator A1's playing a F, and this oscillator A2 is playing a C. So yeah, you could, if you go up 7, you get the 5th sound. So you can kind of stack chords and do cool things with that note value. So let me turn this down real quick on oscillator B2. So the next thing you'll see is you'll see this fine knob. And that's going to affect the sound in a cent. It's called sense value. It's something that's not perceived necessarily as a different pitch to our ear. It'll just sound out of tune. See, as I get closer to +1, it starts to become less noticeable. That's a great thing to do to really make those kind of huge unison supersaw type sounds. So now we have the, let's talk about the main knob. You have volume, which obviously just controls the volume of your oscillator waveform. And then you have this cool little phase knob. The phase knob in Sylenth is pretty cool. What it does is it changes the starting point of the waveform. It only function when re-trigger is selected. So if you don't have this button illuminated, it won't do a thing. But what you can do is, you can kind of hear it more with the saw wave. So let me change that. So what it's doing, it's a really subtle effect that might be hard to hear in a video format. But what it's doing is, if you look at this kind of graphically right here, let's say this is what's happening in time. The sound is going down, up at that slant, back down, and it just keeps repeating that motion of the sawtooth waveform. Well, what it's doing is it's telling it to move on that line just a little bit by degree values. So it can kind of change the sound once you start stacking multiple waveforms together. So if you wanted to have a huge saw sound, it might be good to have on one oscillator start to play with the phase so everything's not sounding uniform and robotic. So next we have this detune knob, which is really cool. It detunes the pitch of basically the individual voices. So if I do it right now, doesn't do a whole lot. You need to have more than one voice. And the more voices you have selected in your voicing tab in each oscillator section, the more pronounced that detune effect will be. This is obviously the easiest and quickest way to create that supersaw sound. So next we have the stereo knob. The stereo knob sets the level of stereo separation between individual voices. So again, you need more than one voice active. So it's kind of widening out the sound. And I can show you that. I should be able to show you that visually as well. So you see how it's widening out a little bit with the more and more voices? When you have that stereo spread, it kind of just spreads out your stereo field. So that's obviously a great way to do those huge unison type leads. And then next you have the pan knob. So I'm going to go back to 1 here for my voices. It just pans things from left to right in your stereo spectrum. And now we have this re-trigger button, which I already kind of talked about, but it goes hand in hand with the phase. When the re-trigger button is enabled, what it will do is it's telling Sylenth to, every time I push a note, it is going back to the beginning of the phase for my oscillator waveform. So if I have this unchecked, it's less robotic sounding. That helps with like pads and more ambient sounds. So you generally want re-trigger selected for those kind of monophonic bass sounds. That will help. It's generally better because you get more of a consistent and clear tone. Then you have this last thing to talk about in the oscillator tab. You have this invert button. Now the invert button inverts the oscillator's output. if you want to kind of do like pulse width modulation sound effects, you can basically invert the resulting waveform. So you could take a saw, and when it's inverted, it flips it and reverses it. So it basically makes it a pulse waveform. So it's going to change the sound. And again, all that really adds up once you start stacking different oscillators together, as opposed to just me showing you this with the one waveform loaded up. And then finally, you actually have, I spoke too soon, you have this copy and paste. So let's say you wanted to create like a supercell sound, and I wanted to, I messed around with the phase, and I had the pitch up a little bit and this note value out for the fine pitch. I can copy this and paste it to the next available oscillator. So now we have, it gets really loud, so that's a really easy starting point that you can use in each of the oscillators. So that basically covers everything that you guys need to know about the oscillator section in Sylenth. And this is just the same for all 4 oscillators, oscillator A1, A2, B1, and B2. It's all the same stuff. Now, finally, for this video, I'm going to, for this part in the video course, I'm going to cover this amp envelope section. In the amp envelope section, you have this is common to every synth. You have what's called the ADSR, and that's also why ADSR is called ADSR. It stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. So I'm going to turn down the volume, or the voice account, and the volume for oscillator A2. And right now you'll notice it's just a click. Hear that? Well, it's because I turned everything down. So you need to have some sustain value up to actually kind of see and actually hear what's going on. So you're going to need to have these knobs up to actually hear a sound. And ironically, one of the easiest ways to show you what's going on with the ADSR of a synth is pulling up another synth. I'm going to pull up Native Instruments Massive, another one of my favorite synths, and I am going to and I can show you what the envelope's kind of doing. So you don't get this graphical or this really gooey looking process in Sylenth. It's more of the modeled after old vintage synths, so you just have knobs and sliders. Here's an envelope in Massive, and you have, see where you say I have attack, decay, and then you have obviously sustain and release. When I'm bumping up this attack, let me go to Sylenth. So I'm holding down a key. See how it takes a long time for it to bring in the sound? So no attack, and attack. So you can already see how that's going to be really, really useful for pads and things like that that evolve over time. So what's actually happening is, let's say you have this, just imagine this shape. So as I bump that attack slider out in Sylenth, think of it as creating this sloping line. So that's basically what I'm doing. Now the decay is telling it how quickly it goes through this gain staging process of attack, decay, sustain, and release. So your first point is attack. Once you reach maximum amplitude on the attack stage in any synth, but definitely speaking with Sylenth here, it's going to enter the decay stage, which is just telling it how quickly it's going to transition from attack, decay to sustain. So for a pluck, for instance, like if I pulled up a kind of a plucky sound here, I'm gonna have a pretty short sustain and a medium length decay. See how my decay is very, very short? And now if I pull up the decay, it starts to sound more like a lead instead of a pluck. So that's what that's really, really useful for in Sylenth is controlling. It also becomes something that you can control different types of sounds with. So with a really with a bass line that's really quick and you're playing multiple notes, you're going to have a shorter decay and a shorter sustain. So let me go back to my initial preset here. And then the sustain is telling Sylenth how long to hold out the note value at maximum volume. And release is how long the note will ring out for after you let up on a key. So you can see down at the bottom, I'm hitting a C note. I'm going to just hit it and let up, and you'll hear the sound ring out for a while after I let up on the key. So that becomes useful, again, for pads and basically sounds that you need more of a release for, that you can actually tailor towards what you're playing. So let me pull up a pluck again. So let me pull up, let's try this one. All right, so let's say that is what you were playing. Well, it doesn't have enough release because I'm playing really choppy. So what you can do is you can kind of, once you design a sound or you're editing a sound and you know that you're playing a chord note or you're doing something that's really plucky and percussive, you can play around with these values to really dial in the quality of sound that you want. And of course, with most sections of Sylenth, you get this copy and paste knob. So if you set something up that you really like in amp envelope A, you can then paste it to your amp envelope B really, really easily. So that concludes video number 2 in this Sylenth Masterclass. Next video, I'm going to be looking at the filter sections in Sylenth, and we're going to cover how to kind of route a sound into it and how to get different effects and sounds out of it. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.